All right, this is the study guide audio for exam 3, final exam, SOC 5. All righty, so 3 major waves of feminism, aka women's rights movement. So, first wave of the women's rights movement started in the 1850s and focused on issues like women gaining the right to vote. Second wave took part in the 60s to 70s, focused on issues like equal representation for women in work, politics, and education. Focused also on issues like access to birth control, abortion, facing issues like domestic violence and sexual assault. Third wave of the women's rights movement has centered on issues of multiculturalism and inclusion, expanding focus to all people, including a focus on issues of sexuality and masculinity, which started in the 1980s. All right, moving on. Chivalry pertains to behaviors and attitudes towards women as if they're put on a pedestal, but is part of a bartering system in which men have more powerful status than women. Paternalism, and again, these are all definitions from your textbook, is the idea that women need to be protected for their own good, which implies independence for men and dependence for women. Patriarchy, again from your book, refers to the subordinate role of women and a social, legal, and political climate based on male dominance and hierarchy. So then, looking at the different kinds of feminism, you have liberal feminism that focuses on the need for women to have the same rights as men, especially equity in politics, work, and education, very connected to the second wave of the women's rights movement. Radical feminism, which argues that sexism is the first and most widespread form of human oppression. You have postmodern feminists that reject the idea that anything is inherently male or female and reject traditional assumptions of truth and reality, as do all postmodernists. All right, moving on. Liberation thesis, again, from your book, argues that the 2 predominant reasons that more women are committing crimes is having more opportunity in the labor force due to changing self-concept of women and girls. Meaning, it's like you can't commit a white-collar crime if you don't have a white-collar job. So that's they're basically saying it's women's liberation, that's the problem. Power control theory, a little bit different, obviously, argues that youth from families characterized as patriarchal reveal greater gender differences in delinquency rates compared to youth from more egalitarian homes. So the expectations of our parents when it comes to gender affect us. Alrighty, and then when it comes to feminist criminology, you got Daly and Chesley Lind. They talk about how feminism or feminist thought is distinguished from other forms of social and political thought. So first they say that this is done so by looking at gender as not a natural fact, but a complex social, historical, and cultural product that is related to but not derived from biological sex differences. They also look at how gender and gender relations order our social life and our social institutions in fundamental ways. They also look at how systems of knowledge tend to reflect men's views of the natural and social world. So the production of knowledge itself is gendered, right? The example that I gave was how we didn't even do, like in 1993, they had to pass a law in Congress to make sure that they were doing medical trials on women at all, because they would test new research pills but never test it on women and just release it into the market as if it was safe for women. Let's see. And then another one was that gender relations are constructs of masculinity and femininity, meaning that it's not as if the gender roles are just kind of fair and equal. It's really based on an organizing principle that men are superior, right? And that they should have superior positions in the social world, in the political world, and in the, and have economic dominance over women. All right, moving on. Oh yeah, also the last one, sorry, is that they think that women should be at the center of intellectual inquiry. Meaning, if we're going to do new research, maybe like include a woman, right? Maybe their perspective might help balance the scales that are unequal. Anywho, moving on, new Jim Crow lockdown. All right, so basically in that myths to address, she talks about how, we have these myths about the war on drugs, that the war on drugs targets kingpins, which, again, we talked about how forfeiture laws are rarely actually targeted towards the rich. They're often targeted towards very poor people. And the other myth being that the war on drugs targets dangerous criminals, which, the majority of people that are in jail for drug crimes are there for, possession, sales, or other non-violent drug crimes. Let's see here. Effect of the war on drugs. Obviously, as far as from rules of the game here, it's how the war on drugs has undermined civil liberties promised in the Fourth Amendment. The Terry v. Ohio case modified Fourth Amendment rights, saying that police were then given authority to conduct searches for weapons if they think someone's a suspect or dangerous, right? Which gives a lot of latitude. Obedience experiments, right? So that's pretty much the answer. Just show that people are susceptible to coercion with police, meaning that we watched the Milgram's obedience experiment, we watched the Ash obedience experiment, and we saw that, people are really gonna not feel very comfortable to say no to the police because they're social creatures and they want to fulfill the expectations of them. And so, whether or not we say it's a consent search, most people are going to be compelled to agree to a search even if they don't feel comfortable with it because they're coerced. Transformation from community policing to military policing. Since the war on drugs, the funding has really changed the way the police systems work, right? The style of policing has evolved from the more community, which is the focus with cooperation and support of the locals, to military policing, which is more of a focus on using tactical weapons and a soldier-like approach, right? Like we talked about how the most common way to serve drug warrants now is SWAT teams, versus in the 1960s and 70s, they were very rarely used, only for like hostage situations or something of that nature. And now they're being used thousands of times a day for drug warrants, right? Which leads to all sorts of consequences. When it comes to legal representation, over 80% of defendants are not able to afford a lawyer. Overloading is the discretion of prosecutors, means that a prosecutor can add excessive charges to your case so that you're more likely to accept a plea deal. Because remember, if they say, okay, well, we caught you with possession of a drug, but you also have these, Ziploc bags in your car, so therefore maybe it was intent to sell or distribute, then even though they know they could never prove that in front of a judge, they add it as a charge. So they can say, well, that'll be a 15-year mandatory minimum. Why don't you plead out and you'll get 1 year, and you still get the drug felony without realizing that, because a lot of people don't trust the system and don't want to go through with the trial, even if they know that they're innocent. Kind of like some of the examples that you saw in 13th, the Khalif Browder situation. Let's see here now. The prison label is a label that creates a second-class citizenship where people are blocked from mainstream society. It brings a parallel world of legal stigma and exclusion. It doesn't matter whether you actually, went to prison or not. Like if you just took the plea bargain and left, you still experience the same exclusions. And the label contributes to a closed circuit of perpetual marginality, right? That it just keeps people caught in this loop where they can't get out. Moving on to color of justice. Racial disparities. So basically, racial disparities are justified using colorblind dog whistles like saying law and order instead of saying, more racist epithets. And the colorblind rhetoric argues that if people of color are in prison more, it's probably because they're more criminal. So it creates this false portrayal. So the system operates in a couple different ways, right? She argues that, the formation of the racial caste system comes about through a couple different stages. So the first is discretion, where police are given free rein to decide who can be perceived as criminal. And then, of course, the racial stereotypes that are perceived through the media have an influence on policymaking, because most people don't actually deal with the system. They just see the police as the good guys. They see the criminals as the bad guys, but we don't really see them as humans. And we don't really get into the conflicts of why people get into crime in the first place. So, also the court system itself has been disabled, so that if people want to say that they've faced racial discrimination, it's very difficult for them to do now, right? You can't use statistics to do so. You have to prove someone's willful intent towards discrimination, which is very difficult unless they're Mark Furman and they can't stop saying the N-word, like in the O.J. Simpson trial. Other than that, it's very difficult to prove. So this makes it very difficult for people to say that the system is racist against them. The media portrayals, again, are a huge part of this because it contributes to a racialized public perception that offenders are people of color, that police are white, even though offenders are also white, police are also people of color, right? They provide, this coverage that contributes to a perception that more crime is also taking place in communities of color, largely that's the only crime that we should be worried about, right? And then when it comes to this perception of crime, why is it important? Because the people, the judges, the juries, the police, the politicians, prosecutors, everyone involved in the criminal justice system is affected by these media portrayals, and it's going to affect how human they see the people in front of them in court. Some Supreme Court changes that she references were that happened from the 90s that limited protecting minorities instead of, so it limited opportunities for minorities to sue for racial discrimination. And, it actually upheld sentencing that disproportionately affects minorities. So before this, the Supreme Court was known for actually kind of giving more rights. But at this point in the 1990s, it started restricting these rights, right? And it gave police the discretion to stop and search whoever they please. All right, racial composition of juries. So it is illegal to dismiss a juror based on race. You can't say like, well, that juror's black, so you can't be a juror, right? But there are laws that allow for arbitrary exclusions. So let's say, oh, you're like, no, it's not because he's black, it's because he's left-handed, right? So that can still lead to racial discrimination, unfortunately. When it comes to criminals, again, that's pretty much the answer. They're the only group in society that we're taught to hate. So we're not really going to go out of our way to make reforms that make their life better because we're taught that they're not redeemable. They should be locked away from society to keep us safe, right? When it comes to the knowledge of the consequences of plea deals, many people that face these plea deals do not know. Like, for example, that they aren't going to be able to vote, or that they won't be able to use public housing, or that they won't any of those kind of things that we talked about with the cruel hand. It's not as if they give you a lesson in this when you leave prison. A lot of people find this out as a consequence later after they've already signed this plea deal, right? Not really knowing the consequences, the long-term consequences. And Michelle Alexander argues that felons are then put into a second-class status because they're subjected to legal forms of discrimination. Again, not being able to get housing, not being able to get financial aid, like all of these other ways, not being able to vote. That creates a second-class status, just similar to what was going on with Jim Crow segregation, right? People weren't able to have the same housing, weren't able to get, financial aid, weren't able to get, access to the same kind of opportunities. It's very similar. When it comes to the boxed-in employment, felons obviously face issues with finding employment because, they're likely to suffer discrimination from employers. They have to check that box on the application. And research has shown that less than a quarter of employers are even willing to employ felons. So this label also can be a problem when it's already difficult for people of color to get a job. So they're already going to be facing racial discrimination in hiring. So now facing this additional burden in getting a job. Debtor's prison is basically what comes about due to people that can't pay their fines when they're released from jail, that they're incarcerated because they can't pay their payments, which technically debtor's prisons are supposed to be illegal in the US, but this happens all the time. Let's see here, minstrel show. So the media representations again. So she argues that when you look at just in general representations of African American men in the media, they've often been used historically to justify or rewrite history. Right, so we saw with the Birth of a Nation situation that the South wanted to have this kind of story about what the South was as this glorious thing, and not like as a war that lost, as a group of people that lost a war. So they created this myth that there was these black men roaming the streets trying to rape white women, that it was something that segregation was needed to keep people safe, right? And so she said that, media representations have also been used to personify black men as dangerous criminals, right? And that this has really developed even into the modern era, where in the past it might have been, just the black male rapist, but now we have this archetype of like the gangster, right? That represent black men as dangerous criminals. And we see this with other race groups as well, right? Or racial minorities that are often portrayed in more criminal ways through the media, which then affects perceptions of people in those groups and outside of those groups who see these representations and start to see them as fact. All right, moving on to chapter 12. So developmental theories look at the evolution of an individual's criminality over time, right? And they focus on the onset, so like when did it start? What's the frequency, like how often? what's the intensity, right? Is it small, is it large? The persistence or duration, and then the desistance, like when does it stop, and other aspects of the criminal career. Lambda is pretty much the most discussed and researched aspect of developmental theory, which is the offender frequency. Pattern of escalation. So basically, developmental theories argue that many life course persistent criminals escalate to more serious crimes, and that the escalation moves from more preteen petty crimes to higher level petty crimes to then more serious criminal activity. So when it comes to low self-control theory, it's also referred to the general theory of crime. And it assumes that self-control has to be established by the age of 10, or this individual will not have self-control, like, permanently. Moffat's developmental... Oh, no, I'm skipping Sampson and Lobbs. Sampson and Lobbs, developmental theory. Alrighty. Basically, they look at the... they emphasize the importance of certain events and life changes that can alter the likelihood of criminal activity, right? So... they look at how transitions can alter trajectories, right? So marriage and stable employment are seen as trajectories, and how these things can then affect the likelihood of someone to continue a criminal career. Moffat's developmental taxonomy argues that there's two types of offenders: the adolescent limited, which is most of us, and the life course persistent, the people that keep offending. Thornberry's interaction model claims that the processes of both social control and social learning theory affect each other in a sort of feedback loop, right? As we talked about how, your connection to certain groups of people, your adherence to school, to parents, etc., that those things kind of connect you back to not offending. So those 5 concepts outlined by Thornberry's interaction model of offending is commitment to school, attachment to parents, belief in conventional values, adoption of delinquent values, and association with delinquent peers. Alrighty, policy implications. So one policy implication of developmental theories is that maybe we should stop poisoning people with like lead. Because again, lead poisoning and other toxins like lead poisoning cause irreversible brain damage, which obviously then affects someone's control, developmental control over themselves. Which can then lead to more criminality. And then universal preschool was another suggested, something suggested by developmental theory, because studies have shown that preschool leads to better performance in school academically, socially, and can be a mediator against later deviance in criminal activity. All right, new Jim Crow. All right, so incarceration and fatherhood, right? So mass incarceration affects many African-American fathers, which also contributes to the perception that African-American men are deadbeat dads, right? So this was like from the beginning of that chapter, you had that Obama speech that he was like, where are the fathers? And he was really condemning the Black community about absent fathers without acknowledging the criminal justice system is a place where like literally millions of fathers are. Let's see here. Oh, Stacey Donnell, racism comes from the structure of society. Yep, that's pretty much the answer to that. So, yeah, it's not just individuals with bigoted ideals, it's the structure of society. New Jim Crow. So she argues that the New Jim Crow works in phases, right? In 3 phases: the roundup, formal control, and the period of invisible punishment. She says that this isn't, what's interesting is that racial bias is not new, right? It's been an issue across the U.S. history, right? It can be seen in the legal exclusion of people of color from serving on juries. You can see in the disproportional rates of arrest between whites and people of color, or the disproportional incarceration rates, right? It's not new. When you look at money for education versus money for incarceration, since the 1980s, California has built dozens of prisons, but 0 universities. Technically, they say they built 1, but really it was just a hospital that became a university. So technically 0 since 1980. So our money priorities within the state are obviously putting much more money towards incarceration than we are towards education. Symbolic production of race. So basically she's talking about how, racial caste systems define how we understand race in a time period. So that's what she means by a symbolic production. So during slavery, being black was defined as being a slave. During Jim Crow segregation, being black was defined as being a second-class citizen. And now, in our modern iteration, during mass incarceration, being black is defined as being criminal. Alrighty, and then this idea of legalized discrimination, right? It's the most obvious parallel to Jim Crow segregation because felons experience substandard living conditions, their actions are monitored, and they're barred from mainstream society, right? And then the Stanford Prison study or experiment demonstrated the power of a social role in changing people's behavior when they're placed in a particular setting, right? So even though they were university students at Stanford, right, that they were transformed into prisoners and guards by just, basically a flip of a coin. And they actually started to inhabit those roles. Some of the prisoners started having psychological meltdowns from being, kept in chains. And some of the guards, especially that one dude, become very cruel and start, kind of inhuman treatment. And it wouldn't have been stopped except for, the Zimbardo who was running the study, his girlfriend at the time, basically got in a big fight with him. And if not for that, then who knows how horribly wrong or even worse the prison experiment would have gone. But, basically what we learned from this is that even just locking someone in a basement room and then playing as a guard and playing as a prisoner, it's the social environment that actually leads to the expectation of certain behaviors, right? So if you're a prisoner, you're supposed to act a certain way. If you're a guard, you're supposed to act a certain way. And the powers of the environment, the power of the role to affect what we actually do to each other in inhuman treatment. All right, that's pretty much it. So hopefully this is a helpful review.